So let me start by saying um, that what you saw just now is actually what is wrong with the way we approach climate change and the solutions. Um, and, and it's really disappointing at one level. The whole thing, the big picture completely goes missing in our thought process. And what we look at is, Richard Thaler, the famous behavioral economist, was quite famous in the 80s and the 90s. He won a Nobel Prize for something that he called bounded rationality or mental accounting, And of course, he was talking in the context of money, that in our heads we create these little pockets of money, for my holiday, for my children's education, for the house I might want to buy someday. And then you have credit card debt, right? Where you are possibly paying 30, 40% interest for the credit card debt that you aren't able to clear because you put money in 10 different pockets, which is possibly earning you nothing or a tiny amount of returns. But the fact is that money is fungible. All money is fungible. There's no different colors for money. They're all the same. But we create these little boxes in our head. And then that works to our detriment. Because we could have easily taken money from one pocket and gotten off that credit card debt that is accumulating 30, 40% interest rates because we are not able to pay it in time, while there's idle money sitting in our own accounts, possibly in a savings account, possibly in a current account or a checking account, as they call it in some countries, or even in a side account, or in a piggy bank. We do exactly the same with climate change. We break it down in terms of mental accounting into interesting and uninteresting subjects. When you talk to people in terms of science, most of us can't grapple with the science. Not because we are stupid or incapable of understanding it, but it just doesn't hold our attention. So, allow me to say this. The entire population, barring a very few exceptions, suffers from heightened attention deficit disorder. That's what is the challenge of climate change. And that's why, when we say the planet is at the crossroads, it is really at the crossroads. We have been talking for 30 years, produced precious little to show, and I'm talking about the climate change negotiations. We'll soon have COP30. We'll have COP30 because one or two went missing during COVID times. Otherwise, we'll actually be having COP32 in Brazil next year and COP31 in Baku this year. And we are at a crossroad because of 5 very specific reasons. One, many of us somehow believe magically that we don't have a problem, or it is somebody else's problem. I really don't need to do much, and the problem will disappear on its own. Now, while in our mental accounting, that might be true, but in pure science terms, that's a bunch of nonsense. In pure science terms, we are actually at a stage in the history of the planet that we have literally turned the clock back in the last 100 years. And that is fact. That's not going to change. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is that there are a lot of great ideas, there are a lot of great innovations, inventions that are desperately looking for attention, but we wouldn't give them the attention. All the best ideas are useless if you can't find money to implement them. And I have heard quite a few good ones over the last 2 days, listening to very empathetic, passionate entrepreneurs that have been really trying very hard to get the attention of the people that matter. And then the third big problem is that the investor community that still talks in terms of magical returns. When the entire planet is literally unraveling, we still talk about, oh, I need my money to double in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, They use X, I need 5X returns. Not sure where that will come from when the planet completely disintegrates in terms of the fabric of life that we are used to. And then the policy. That's the fourth. Policymakers, instead of focusing on solutions, are focused on whom to blame. And that's been the story or the narrative of all these conferences or parties that people show up. Last year in Dubai, there were 85,000 people that showed up. The most attended climate change COP in the history of the conference of parties that has been going on since 1992. What did they achieve? Nothing. And of course, there's one coming up in Baku. And this year, the interesting thing is that we have one going on in Cali in Colombia right now. There's one coming up in Baku in 2 weeks. Then soon thereafter, there will be one, the convention to prevent desertification, that will be happening in Saudi Arabia. So all of them in 1 year. Normally, they alternate between this year and the next year and the year after. But this year, somehow, they're all happening in the same year, the first time actually, since these conference of parties began. I have very little hope that anything will happen there. I'm an optimist, and I have supreme belief in the ability of humans to actually turn the clock around and do the right thing. But that's not this group of people. And then the last and the most significant challenge is that young people who actually should be very worried because it is their future we are talking about here. If you look at people like me, my generation has completely failed humanity, and the one before me and the one before me over the last 100 years. I would certainly like to believe I'm an exception, and I would certainly like to believe that there are millions of exceptions like me, but that's certainly not the planet, that's not humanity. And so young people, when they are very interested, how can I, and they're really looking at the same model. And what is that model? I want the American way of life. If you want the American way of life, let me put it very bluntly to you. America has roughly 4% of the world's population, uses 35% of the world's resources. If you take that equation and extrapolate it to the planet, if the planet was going to have the American way of life, we will need 6 more planets. That's not going to happen. Last we checked, through all the data that is available through Hubble telescope, there's not a planet in sight within billions of light years distance that can sustain us in any meaningful way. You can create some colonies here and there, take 10 people to Mars or 20 people to Moon. That's not planet. That's not existence. So that's the reality. Are the governments going to help us and save us? I don't think so. Not because the governments don't want it. They certainly want to help. But they can't for one simple reason. The global GDP, if you take the entire GDP, which is in excess of about $100 trillion, if you break it down, it's about 30% in the public sector and roughly about 70% in the private sector. But then again, it depends on the country. There are some countries that are very low rates of industrialization. There, the public sector could be 40% and the private sector could be roughly 60%. But if then you go to the US and all highly industrialized nations, that the public sector would be roughly 25%, and the private sector could be even as high as 75%. Now you take a small sliver of that pie, say 30%, and you're trying to solve not just your own problem, because the more industrialized countries actually have bigger problems. The UNEP emissions gap report, which comes out every year, and I would strongly encourage you to read it. It just came out 3 days ago. It's telling us that we need to reduce our emissions by 42% in the next 6 years. They must be smoking something that I don't know what it is, because there is zero evidence to prove that we are reducing anything at all. Then they go on one step further and say, we actually need to reduce 57% by 2035, assuming that we have reduced 42% by 2030. Not happening. There is zero evidence. After COVID, we've actually gone up. Not gone up from COVID, which was a little low, we've gone up compared to pre-COVID times. So is everything lost? Is there any possibility of us coming back as a species? The answer is an emphatic yes. How? A problem created by 8 billion people is not going to be solved by a few governments and a few companies. They can try, and some of them really deserve all our appreciation, both governments and companies that are really doing the best they can. But 8 billion people have to change behavior. That's what is required. And not big changes that might happen in due course, but it is as easy as flipping a light switch as you walk out of a room, because it does not need the luminescence anymore, because there's nobody in the room that needs that light. If you're in the bathroom, you're not using the water, can you shut the tap? Because when 8 billion people shut the tap, even if it's 1 liter of water they saved, that's 8 billion liters of water saved. That's the power in numbers. And then that's what we at the Global Alliance have been trying to pull together a group of very inspiring entrepreneurs across the planet. And we'll be announcing very soon the world's largest green economy accelerator, with the goal of creating 10 million green jobs in the next 5 years. We'll most likely announce it in Davos. And what is it? Is it big technology? It's ground shifting stuff? No. It is simple technology, but the power of getting together people and inspiring them and being inspired by them to do what matters the most, which is put our heads together and our hands together and start doing something about the problem. Not be overwhelmed about the problem. Oh my God, it's such a big problem, I can't do anything about it, so let me not do anything at all. That's not the solution. Humans didn't get here to this beautiful arena, or if you look outside, this building was built 200 years ago. Or if you go a little further, look at the ceramic museum in Aveiro. When I went there, I was completely taken aback. The grandness of the imagination, long before modern technology took hold, the way people really did these things. Extraordinary enterprise. So we are capable of that novelty, that imagination, and that ambition. What we need to do, and that's why I often say SDG 17, which is the SDG for partnerships, should actually have been SDG 1. Because without partnerships, you're not going to achieve any of the other SDGs. It is the power of partnerships, people coming together, helping each other, opening yourself to possibilities of collaboration and cooperation is what is going to save the day, and that's what is going to engineer the kind of paradigm shift that will not only make change possible, make climate action happen, but it also will give the young people a chance to live on to tell the story for the next generation. Thank you.